In this video, I'm going to be discussing a new plugin that I just released, and that is called Select Saturation. This plugin does exactly what it says it does in the name, is it makes a selection based on the saturation values in your image. This plugin requires Photoshop version 24.4.1 or higher, and the reason why is because this plugin was created using the new image API that Adobe just released for the plugins platform. And if you are on Photoshop version 25 or higher, which I am here in the beta release, and that is CC 2024, in that version, this can be recorded into a Photoshop action, and it won't in prior versions, and that is because Adobe just released the action recordability feature for the plugins menu in version 25 in the beta release. So this plugin is pretty simple for what it does. Like I say, it selects based on the saturation values of your image, but the use case for what you would use it for can be pretty advanced. So because of that, this video is going to get somewhat technical, and this is really meant for advanced users who do advanced masking in their images. And so there's just a couple of settings here. You can select based on the layer that you're on, or you can select by merged. And if you're selecting by merged, it's going to select based on the saturation values of the entire document as if it was merged into one. Although it's not going to merge your document, it's just going to make the selection based on that document if it was merged. And then you can make an inverted selection, so to select the inverse of the saturation. So let me just make a quick selection here. And then let's add a hue sat adjustment layer. And so it's taken that selection and loaded that into your mask. And if we click on the mask, what we are looking at here is an inverse of the saturation. So the areas of the image that were low saturation are brighter, and the areas that were higher saturation are darker. That is a typical use case for how you would use it. I'm going to come back and discuss this image and show you a more advanced technique that I like to do. However, I'm going to first go over and switch gears here so I can kind of technically describe what the plugin is doing, and then I'll come back to this image and I'll show you a really cool real-world use case that you could use the plugin for. And so what we've got in Photoshop is the RGB color mode. Your colors are made up of red, green, and blue. And what we're looking at is the intensity of each of those colors, and it mixes those together to make a color. So I've got a bunch of different layers here with different colors. If we just look at one of those, you'll see we've got a red, green, and a blue value. But what we want to do is actually make a selection based on this saturation value. There's also a hue, saturation, and brightness levels to each pixel. However, there is no color mode that is native to HSB. That's hue, saturation, brightness. None of these color modes are going to give us a channel for that saturation. So that's where this plugin comes in. So if we look at the different colors here, you can see that we can have a very different color that's much darker here, but still have that same saturation value. So what we've got is the colors in the middle here are all set to 50% saturation. The colors on the right side are set to 75%, and the colors on the left are all set at 25% saturation. And even though the brightness and hue changes a lot, the saturation values are the same for each column. So let's just make a selection. I'm going to switch it to merged because we're looking at a bunch of layers here, and we're going to make a selection based on the entire document. And it's loaded the selection based on the saturation values. And this is a mathematically correct selection, which has not been possible before with native Photoshop tools, other than a very old Photoshop plugin. It was think it was called RGB to HSB or something. I don't remember exactly, but it was like a 20-year-old plugin, I think, that I think it's been discontinued for quite a long time. In any case, we've loaded the selection based on the saturation values. So I've got a layer here that's all black, and I'm going to fill in white above that layer. This will make sense in just a moment here. I'm just doing this to show you what the selection did. So we filled white, but these 3 squares on the left are now showing 70 or 25% brightness. The ones in the middle are showing 50, and the ones on the right side are showing 75. And that is the exact saturation values that those pixels were. So we loaded this selection based on the saturation values. Then when we used the fill tool, it filled 25%, 50%, and 75% based on how much selected that pixel was. Hope that makes sense. Now, I just did this to kind of show you what it's doing in the selection because it was an easy way to demonstrate it. How you would actually do this, or you use it most of the time, is to create a mask. So if we were to make this selection, for example, and then add an adjustment layer, it's going to make this mask. And if we go into the mask, if I sample the colors in the mask, you'll see that now this is 33% on the left, 59%, and then 80%. So upon first glance, if you're sampling colors in your mask, those are not going to actually match your saturation values 1-to-1. And so it would appear that it did not do this correctly. However, it actually did it mathematically perfect. And that is because the masking in Photoshop works on a non-linear grayscale color space. And what that means is that it's the effect that the mask has is not 1-to-1 based on the brightness of the value in that mask. So to get a 50% blend in your mask, you actually need this value of 59% in the mask. I'm going to come back to this at the end of the video because I'm going to demonstrate this and prove this out for those who are interested. And if you're an advanced Photoshop user doing masking, it's something that you probably want to know. So just make sure you watch through the end of the video, and I'm going to actually demonstrate this. But let's switch gears here. Let's go to just a real world example of how you would use this plugin. And don't write this down step by step. It's going to vary based on your image. So you kind of need to understand how it's working and adapt your technique to your images. But before I do anything here, I'm just going to discuss the saturation in Photoshop. There's multiple ways you can adjust saturation, and each of those works a little bit differently. So you've got your hue saturation layer, and this is like the oldest way to adjust saturation in Photoshop. So if let's just crank this all the way up to 100, and you can see that a lot of these pixels, you start getting clipping in your channels, and it's oversaturated. So let's now go to the vibrance adjustment layer. So in the vibrance, you've got a saturation and a vibrance setting. So I'll start with the saturation and go up to 100 here. So if we look at and compare, I'm looking at the hue saturation, and you can look at these pixels in here and see how these are really, you can see where the channels have clipped in here. If we go to the vibrance with our saturation up on 100, you see it's got a much different look than the saturation slider in the hue sat adjustment does. So these work completely differently, and you can see in the vibrance, the areas that were lower saturation to start don't get saturated that much. And in the hue saturation, it's much more aggressive on these. So because of that, different images, you might want to use one versus the other. Now in the vibrance slider, you've also got a vibrance adjustment. So the difference between vibrance and saturation is the vibrance actually has a built-in saturation mask to where the highly saturated areas are not getting the adjustment as strong as the lower saturation areas. So this is already incorporating a saturation mask, although I'm not able to really make this sky pop with the colors I want. And even with the saturation slider, I'm not in this vibrance adjustment. And by the way, this vibrance works similar here in Photoshop than in your Camera Raw or Lightroom. Although I think in Camera Raw and Lightroom, this vibrance is a little bit stronger on the upper end. But in any case, let's just get started with this plugin, and I'm going to show you what I want to really do. I want to bring out color in this sky, and this sky is very low saturation here. So we're at 7%, 9%, and then if we look in some of these areas here, we've got like 80% saturation and 89% here. So what we're going to do, I'll leave this on layer and I'll invert the selection. I'm going to make a selection. I'm going to use the older hue saturation adjustment because that has a stronger effect on the lower saturated areas than the vibrance saturation adjustment. So you never want to use this hue saturation adjustment. As a general rule, you never want to go up to 100. I'm just going to go up to like 75 here or so. Just so where I can see the sky is really popping with that color. Now I'm going stronger here than I normally would, just so you can see the effect here. But if we disable the layer mask, you can see that it's having a stronger effect on those areas that were already saturated there. Okay, that is what you can do to have a stronger effect on the areas with lower saturation. But I'm going to take this a step further. Let's duplicate this. So I've made another copy of the layer by using Control J on Windows, or that'd be Command J on Mac. But what I'm going to do is in this lower layer here, I'm going to go into the mask and invert this. So Control I to invert it. And so now this mask is having a stronger effect on the highly saturated areas, where the mask on top is having a stronger effect on the lower saturation areas. So I'm going to go in this bottom one here, and instead of turning it up, I'm going to turn it down. So you see if I turn this down, these areas that were highly saturated, I'm pulling the saturation value down on those. And on the upper one, I'm pulling the saturation values up on the sky area that was lower saturation. I hope people are following me here because, like I say, this can get kind of advanced. But if you look at the original image, you see how the sky has got almost no color. And if we look at the adjustment now, you can look at all that color we brought in the sky and in the water reflections. But then these areas that started out with higher saturation, you can look and see that now with these two combined layers, those have barely changed at all. So we've avoided oversaturating these areas. Now you could also run, say, a vibrance layer without a mask above it, and then adjust everything as a whole to get the final look you want after you've done these other two. So it can get, like I say, pretty technical with how you get this, but you can get you can control your saturation a lot better than you could without using the masking. I'm going to undo all this here and show you another somewhat advanced technique. Again, I'm going to invert the selection. Let's add our hue saturation adjustment. Let's crank this way up here. Another thing you can do is in the mask itself, if I alt-click on Windows or option-click on Mac, you can actually use a curves layer if you want to adjust how that mask is working. So I've really added some contrast to the mask. So these areas that started out higher saturation, I've almost completely removed any effect this mask will have. So let's undo that. It's kind of hard to see here. So if you click on the mask without going into it, you can actually run your curves on this while you're looking at it. And in some images, you'll see the effect more than others, but and it's pretty subtle, but you can see the difference between the two, where the by applying the curves, these highly saturated areas had less of an effect overall with the mask. That's pretty much it with this image for what I'll show you. That double masking technique that I showed you a little earlier, that works really good, but also you can use that with the vibrance adjustment too. So you can apply this mask to either the hue saturation or the vibrance, depending on your image. And if you play around with it, you can get it to behave differently based on how you're doing the masking and if you're using curves or whatever. And this is just one use case scenario for the select saturation. You can also use it to create selections based on saturation. I'm not going to go into all the uses for this. If you're an advanced user and you know what you want to do with the saturation selection, you can certainly make the selection and do whatever you want with it. But I did want to come back to this because I know some people were probably wondering about this non-linear gray space or the gray color space I talked about. So I'm going to actually do a demonstration, just a proof of concept more for this, so you can understand why in your mask your values don't equal the exact saturation values, even though the effect it's having is exactly equal. So we've got two colors here. We've got blue on top, which is a hue of 240. Your blue value is 255, red and green are 0. So 240, saturation 100, brightness 100. Below that, I've got a green, which is 120, 100, 100. And then we've got the green value at 255, the red and blue 0. So if I set the opacity of this top layer to 50%, that's going to give us an exact equal mix of this blue and green. So what we're seeing now is a cyan color. If I sample this blended color, remember that the green hue was 120, blue was 240. The exact middle point between those is 180. Saturation 100%. And now the brightness is 50 because it's done an exact mix of the blue and green. So remember, those values started at 255 each. The exact middle point is 127.5 if you divide 255 by 2. I don't know why it rounds one down and one up. I'm not really sure. But in any case, you can see this is cyan, 50% brightness, with the hue being right in between 120 and 240, exactly the midway point. So let's go in. Let's try to do the same thing with a mask here. So if I alt-click on the mask, or that's option-click on Mac, I can go in and view the mask. Now, it would stand to reason that if you painted with a brightness of 50%, so we're at 50% gray here, you would think that would also give us an equal mix, the same as if you were using 50% opacity on that layer. However, let's take a selection or select the color of this combined mixed layers here. We're looking at the hue of 162, so we're not seeing the same thing. We're not seeing that hue of 180 with an equal mix of green and blue. Instead, it's shifted more towards green, and we've got a green value of 150 and a blue value of 105. And the reason why it shifted more towards green, this layer below, is because in this mask, it's that non-linear gray space. 50% in that mask is going to give us less than 50% opacity on this blue, so we're seeing more of the green. So I don't know why Adobe did that. It's just, it can be a bit confusing, but the actual value to get the perfect 50% blend is 149, 149, 149. It's 149 or 150. I don't remember exactly which one gives us that perfect blend. I think it's 149. Anyways, let's just set our brush to that. Now you see that over here we've got 50% brightness. Over here it's showing 149 and 59% brightness. And then if we look at the resulting mix color, you see these two are different. But the one that was blended with the 59% brightness with the values at 149 instead of 128, that gives us our hue of 180 with our same mix of green and blue. Again, one rounds down, one rounds up. I don't know why, but that value of 59% in your mask is giving us that equal mix, and that pixel is being 50% affected. Whereas where we've brushed in the pixel at 50% brightness, that gives us less than 50% opacity. So that is why, again, let me go back and demonstrate. That is why, again, if you do a selection and then create a mask, that is why the values in your mask, when you sample, are going to be a little bit different than the actual saturation values in your image, although the effect that the mask has is the exact percentage of the saturation value in your image. That was a lot. I hope that people followed, but like I say, this video was meant for advanced users who do advanced masking. If I wanted to touch these concepts so you really understand how this works, although the operation of the plugin is pretty simple itself. Anyways, if you made it this far in the video, thanks. Be sure to test this plugin out because this is a really great way to adjust saturation in your images.